Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Alice. I am a Senior Outreach Specialist here at JoVE, and we will allow a couple of minutes to make sure everybody's able to connect, to have a set up, and to grab a glass of water or a cup of coffee, whatever you like, before we start our session today. So the topic of discussion is engaging students with digital libraries. And we have a very special guest today to walk us through some of the examples of how engagement can happen. But before we begin, we have the usual housekeeping items that I'd like to share with you. So we're all familiar with Zoom. You don't need any instructions, but there's a chat box there. If you want to add some comments throughout the session, it's always lovely to hear people's voices, to see somebody say hi, or even just to get some comments. So feel free to use that as you please. And at the same time, we have a Q&A box just next to it. And at the end of the session, we are going to have, the session should last about 45 to 50 minutes. At the end of the session, we're going to have, after the presentation, a Q&A moment where you can share your thoughts and ideas, and our speaker will take some time to reply. We'll try and get as many questions across as we can. So, boring bit is over. Now, let me introduce you to your speaker today. So, Dr. Leo Appleton is a researcher and a faculty member at the University of Sheffield. But before teaching an MA in librarianship studies, he has had a very, very long career as a practicing librarian. And so in this situation where we're trying to address a topic that is very dear and near to librarians, I think it's very important to actually have access to knowledge that comes from people who have had positions in several different departments and several different situations within the managerial sector of libraries. He's worked at a variety of institutions, so he's got plenty of experience to share. And we've come across his profile because he's also published a few papers about engagement and about libraries. So engagement itself is a word that resonates a lot with a lot of different communities, a lot of different people around the world. And it might feel a little bit empty sometimes to talk about engagement. What is engagement? What does it actually mean to have people who are engaged in a conversation, in an activity? What we want to present today, and what Leo will present us today, is an actual series of cases and situations where we have seen engagement come through the library, both physical and digital. And so thanks to his expertise, I hope we will have a very engaging discussion. Leo, the floor is yours, and we will resume the conversation at the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alice. And can I just check you can hear me still and you can see my presentation on the screen?
Yes, I can hear you and I can see everything.
Excellent. So that means all our delegates can see and hear me as well. So thank you again, Alice, for inviting me to speak at this JoVE webinar. It's great to be here. And thanks for the warm welcome and introduction. So just to kind of revisit that, I am Leo Appleton. I'm a teacher at the Information School at the University of Sheffield in the UK. I'm the Director of Education for the Information School, but previously been the Programme Coordinator for our Librarianship MA, and I also do a lot of teaching on a distance learning online MA called Library and Information Service Management. So I'm in an academic position very much about teaching and learning with regards to information science and librarianship, but I've only been in this role for about 4 years. Prior to that, I had a 25-year career as an academic librarian, really, ranging from starting as a cataloguer in a university library, bibliographic services manager, a subject and liaison librarian before moving into more managerial roles. And I had 3 senior leadership roles as Director of Library Services at 3 different universities in the UK before jumping and making that career switch to academia. So hopefully what I bring to you today is some of my experience both as a teacher and a teacher teaching in an online environment and digital environment, but also as an academic librarian and academic library leader who's done a lot of work with students and students' engagement. So the title of my presentation is Engaging Higher Education Students in Physical and Digital Library Environments. And I like to think I do bring some experience of that here, but I have to forewarn you, this is probably more about the physical library environment with a view to you asking questions, us having some discussion about how we take our good student engagement practice further into the digital environments, and that will come towards the end of the presentation. So my contact details are there as well, and my Twitter handle. So if you want to get in touch with me after the webinar, I'm very happy for people to ask further questions and continue the discussion outside of this. So with regards to what I'm going to cover just in the next 20-25 minutes before we open the floor, I'm going to talk about student engagement in a more macro sense from an institutional level. So what do we mean by students' engagement and student engagement within the higher education sector? Then slightly differentiate student engagement with learning from student engagement with services. So I want to talk a bit about how students engage with learning and then how students engage with academic libraries. And within the academic library context, engagement with learning again, how we work partnerships and collaborations, and how we capture student voice. Then towards the end, I'm going to bring it all together with some examples of student partnership, student engagement projects that I've been with, and then we'll hopefully transfer what we've been talking about into the digital environment. So just to start with, I've got 3 propositions for you around student engagement. Firstly, if we continuously observe how students use our libraries and library services, we'll be able to continuously improve them and deliver what our students require and expect. So that proposition is about observing our students in our library environments. Second proposition, if we engage with our students and keep asking them what they want in the library from our library services, then we'll be able to keep on responding and keep on improving our services. So that proposition is slightly different. That's about a dialogue, asking students what they want and what they expect, rather than us just observing them and making choices and decisions about what students want and what they expect. And then the third proposition is being professional and striving for excellence in service delivery means that we'll always be delivering an excellent student experience. You could take that doesn't necessarily have to be about a library service, that could be any element of a higher education institution or a university. So just going to linger on those for a little while because they kind of underpin some of the things I'm now going to talk about. So now we'll revisit these propositions at the end of my kind of short presentation. So firstly, in academic libraries, I think we probably all know what we mean by student engagement. But my question here would be, have you ever stepped outside of your library environment and thought about it more holistically from an organisational perspective? So how do students engage in general? And how does your university consider student engagement? So what do we really mean by student engagement? Because we want students to engage at university in their learning and their attainment. So we want them to be really engaged in what they're doing from a teaching and learning perspective. Engagement can also be with respect to partnership and collaboration between students and faculty. Similarly, what's often kind of talked about in the student engagement context is student voice, student opinion. So capturing student feedback into their experience. And then we also talk about techniques and methods for student engagement. So there's different ways in which we talk to students, engage with students, and I'm going to unpack these as part of the presentation. So if the previous slide was in general, so not necessarily library specific, what do we mean by student engagement with the academic library? So I'm going to make some assumptions that you're coming to this with some experience, some understanding of or certainly your understanding of student engagement in the academic library. I'm quoting myself here, so it's 3 bullet points from from a paper I've written, and I've included in the references at the end. But it's a literature review about student engagement and what student engagement means for academic libraries. And I've suggested there are three broad contexts which are going to form the three themes I'm about to talk about. Firstly, engagement in forming partnerships between students and librarians, so closely working together, students and library and information professionals. Then engagement through seeking student voice and opinion about library services, facilities, resources. So where we do engage with students in order to try to help improve services. So both of those areas should enable to do that. And then I want to it's a slightly different take on engagement, but engagement in learning in the library and through library instruction. So again, there's a kind of transactional and relational engagement when we teach students. And as academic librarians, we are in a kind of privileged position that we deliver services, but we also are engaged in teaching and learning as well, and actually delivering our own kind of information literacy content through teaching and learning activity. So let's just move on to the next slide, where I'm just going to again unpack some themes around student engagement. And this is just a few bullet points from a report. I appreciate that this is quite UK centric, but a report from the Government Department Business Innovation and Skills in 2011, and similarly 2016. There were two kind of white papers around students at the heart of the university experience. And in that respect, student engagement in their higher education happens across all aspects of university and college life, or we need it to. They need to be engaged in what they're doing, from being in the classroom, from being in the careers centre, from being in the student services arena, accommodation, refectory, and then we can move on to libraries, academic skills centres. And quite a lot of this engagement results from the commodification of higher education and the need to position students so that they have greater influence on their institution, but also on the sector. So student voice becomes fairly major here because of the huge sums of money being exchanged or being paid by students in order to get their higher education. And student engagement is a result of accountability and the expectation of universities to deliver a more student-centred higher education. Again, that comes out of the marketisation and commodification of higher education. And then the quote at the bottom by Koo suggests, again, this is a holistic institution-wide students' engagement, that students' engagement is the time and effort that students devote to activities that are empirically linked to desired outcomes and what institutions do to induce students to participate in these activities. So you could say student engagement is about how we encourage, champion, support students to take the effort to embrace the institution, embrace their learning to achieve the desired outcome of that degree, of that master's degree, whatever it might be. So one area of university life that we really need students to engage in is, of course, learning and development. The students are in the institution, in the organisation to learn. And at a university level, Kehu suggests there are different levels in which students engage in the pedagogic activities, their learning and development, on a behavioural level, emotional level, cognitive level, psychological level, socio-cultural level. Now, I'm not going to go into those in detail. You can follow up that reference. But ultimately, students are in the institution to learn. So that a lot of that learning, as you'll all be aware, happens and takes place in the library, in the learning resource centre, in the learning centre. So how do we see our students engaging physically in the library or digitally in the library at these different levels? Are there areas in which we're observing our students engaging with learning in the library? So if we acknowledge that students are here to learn and that they do some of that in the libraries, we need to be aware of what the literature is saying about how students engage in teaching and learning in general. What does engagement in the classroom mean and look like? And how do we observe and enable that in our library spaces as well? Because when a student is learning at university, wherever it is, if it's in the careers centre, the library, the classroom, the lab, When they're learning, that's their student experience. When a student is being taught by a teacher, a careers advisor, a librarian, that then is their student experience. So when a student is interacting in the library, in whatever way it might be, studying, browsing shelves, doing some social learning with friends in the library cafe, that is their student experience. So the student experience is whatever they're doing in the library and whatever they're doing in the institution. And similarly, wherever and however and whatever they're learning. So just some rhetorical questions here. How do your students engage with you as academic librarians? How do they use the library to achieve those desired outcomes? And the ultimate desired outcome is the attainment of their degree programme. How do they engage with learning in the library and through your services, facilities and resources? How do you see that actually taking place? So the focus there is on the students to do the engaging in those learning spaces. But then we can flip that around and say, well, how do you as academic librarians engage with your students? How do you encourage effective usage of your library by students? How do you enable effective learning in your library? And you do that through every element of your library service provision: the physical space, the layout, the design, the planning, the resources available, the IT infrastructure, the staff skill sets around teaching and learning, the delivery of skills, the library programs that you have. So you are doing lots of engagement, but at the same time, you need students to engage back. So it's definitely starts to look like a two-way thing. So I've quoted general kind of student engagement type literature so far. I just want to share with you these two authors, Tim Schlack and Sarah Pittaway. Both have written about student engagement with academic libraries and academic librarians. And Tim suggests there are four layers or four elements of student engagement. One is student learning, so students actively engaging with the learning opportunities that we provide in the library. So things like our information literacy, information skills, academic skills training. There is similarly in Tim's paper, a citizenship and service-based learning, where students engage with the things that we have in the library, with the facilities and the resources. There's technology and programmatic learning experiences, so where we provide kind of learning and engagement opportunity in our physical spaces, but students then re-engage through technology and digital and start to access resources and services and teaching and training in those digital environments. And then there's relational engagement, where there's an intentional customer service relationship building. And that can be through your customer service, reader services, it can be through your library liaison engagement in the classroom, engagement with faculty, etc. So that's an interesting paper. I think it complements my own literature review quite well as well, if you look at the two alongside each other. And then Sarah Pittaway asked a really good question. What does an engaged student look like as opposed to a disengaged student? So we talk about student engagement because we want our students to be engaged. We want to see engaged students, but it does help if you ask, well, what is it we want to see? What does a disengaged student look like? Someone who's not engaged in the library. And then Sarah concludes her paper with saying academic libraries create favourable conditions in order to facilitate the likelihood of more engagement behaviours. So almost starting from a deficit where students aren't engaged, and we can create the environment to enable that engagement. So it's the things that we do to enable and enthuse our students to make the most, to engage back, to re-engage, so that they're doing the very best they can to achieve their desired outcomes of ultimately attainment and learning. So let me just, on an earlier slide, I said there were three kind of key themes in my literature review around student engagement. The first one was an engagement with learning. Now I'm using this engagement in the classroom. I feel quite privileged I can come to this as both a teacher who does a lot of teaching every day, and also a former librarian who did a lot of teaching as well as a librarian, but also managed kind of teaching initiatives and academic skills and academic literacies. So we're engaged, we're involved in information literacy teaching. In fact, we could add more literacies to that: digital literacy, object literacy, visual literacy. We do a lot around academic skills and academic literacies. We encourage active learning in both physical and digital environments. And when I say we, I'm talking about kind of the academic library sector. So during the, between 2020 and 2022, I think lots of people became more adept at pivoting into those digital environments, and a lot of that has sustained. And then we may apply different pedagogies to our learning in order that students can engage. We may use problem-based learning approaches. We may use flipped classroom approaches. We may use gamification. There are many other pedagogies that we may use in our teaching and learning. The point is, I think, over kind of the last 10, 20 years, academic librarians have become professional teachers in their own right. So we bring this pedagogy into the library environments and into our library instruction. Other things we might do in terms of engaging students from a learning perspective, but in order to help shape our services rather than to be kind of instruction for learning purposes, is we might encourage students to reflect. So we might get them involved in some reflective exercise, reflective thinking, reflective writing, reflective journaling around their experience of the library. So that's kind of engagement with learning, but with a service improvement end goal. We may also encourage peer-to-peer learning in those library environments, so that we've got students teaching and supporting fellow students in using the library or in library instruction and academic skills. And I've certainly been involved in peer support programs within the library for kind of academic literacies and academic skills. So what's key here, though, is this is about students needing to and wanting to engage in their learning, and us enabling that learning to take place through us engaging back with the students. So engagement with learning and engagement with teaching, I think, is a little bit different to what we more commonly talk about when we talk about student engagement, which is with a view to developing services, enhancing services, improving services in order that the students have the very best student experience. It can all be packaged together as ensuring a quality and an excellent student experience. But I think there is a difference. That engagement with learning happens all over the campus. Some of the other stuff I'm now going to talk about are things that you can do in order to create dialogue so that students engage with you as a librarian and you as a library service in order for you to continually develop and improve. One of the key areas is partnership and collaboration. And in the past, there would have been a kind of teacher-pupil dynamic or relationship between teachers and students, and also between librarians and students. But I think over time we've become more familiar, more tolerant of more of a partnership approach. And I would very strongly encourage and champion partnership and collaboration with students, and working with students as co-collaborators, co-creators and co-producers in all our planning and development processes, and therefore removing the power relationships and dynamics that used to be in place. If we work with students as peers, and I'm coming to this now as both a teacher and an academic librarian, if we work with students as peers, we get more meaningful engagement, and students feel empowered to influence their immediate educational surround, and that can be and is your library service. So this is all about developing relationships with students, being excellent communicators all around, keeping students in the loop, keeping students at the heart of everything you do. And ultimately, it's about just keeping a dialogue going with students, whether that's your student body, if you have representatives of the student body, or you convene particular groups of students, depending on, I suppose, who you actually want to target and talk to. So the other thing that's quite often captured in the literature is student voice. You could call that student feedback, and capturing the student voice and getting student feedback into service can also be associated with marketization. We might call it gathering customer insight or market research or gathering customer opinion. But I think it's now used more meaningfully in order for us to genuinely develop services for the greater good to improve services for students. And it also means if we think about student voice and gaining particular student feedback, we can target particular user groups within the library. For example, you may just want to capture the student voice of postgraduate taught students, or you may want to capture the student voice of those students who we might consider as marginalized groups of students. And the ways of capturing student voice or bringing student feedback into your library, there are many, many ways to do it. And these are some of the things I talk about in or review the literature on in that literature review. The fact that this has all kind of traditionally been done ever since we've been almost measuring our performance through something that looks like a library survey. I think they're diminishing now, but you can still use survey techniques, questionnaires, spot surveys to capture some student voice, to capture some students' opinion. But I think we're becoming more dialogic and more bespoke in the ways that we target and engage with students. And it means that we can then do that with specific groups, and we can use techniques and methods such as interviews, structured interviews, focus groups, some UX tools like touchstone tools. So there's lots of kind of ways in which we can capture student voice. Another way, and quite popular way, is through student employment or student internships within the library, and that's not just for the sake of making up the numbers, but it's employment or internship with a strategic objective of, as well as getting some work from the student, but to capture some student feedback or student voice. You can encourage student representation, either paid or unpaid, on library groups. You might have library committees or project teams or project boards. You could have student ambassador schemes where you have students who champion the library, do peer-to-peer teaching and learning activities in and around the library. You can use user experience techniques, which you'll hopefully be familiar with, but as a means of capturing student voice. So you can use ethnography, that's where our observation would come into it, in order to plan spaces, do library design, ensure that libraries in a physical sense are fit for purpose and what students want. But you can transfer all of that into capturing the student voice around digital as well. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So what I've presented there is a very brief overview of the literature review, which I've referred to in my references. Let me just bring it all together as I move to the end of the presentation and just talk about three particular initiatives that I was involved in, which I feel quite proud of because they were, for me, fairly high level student engagement initiatives. And just to put it into context, because I believe most of the delegates, participants in this session are from America. In the UK, all our universities have a student union, and the student union operates like a trade union would. And the student union, for me, for me as a library director, was always the key relationship. It was my into the kind of student body, if you like. So all these initiatives involved a close working relationship with the student union. You may have different platforms, but when I talk about student union, that's what that is. That's the student body. So just very quickly, and there's a paper that accompanies this, we said we did was around how we developed a kind of fairly major partnership between the library and the student union when I worked at Liverpool John Moores University. And it started with getting meaningful student representation. And this is around about 2011, 2012, meaningful student representation on some key library projects around the new library management system, the new discovery platform, a lot of interactive or proactive student representation on a project called the Student Experience Review Project, which ultimately, through the student voice, meant that the libraries and student support services came together to create a whole brand new super converged service called Library and Student Support. And it created, well, it turned the libraries into kind of super hubs for library and IT transactions, student service transactions, welfare, careers appointments, where students went to submit coursework and assessments, etc. So it really changed the shape and the nature of how we delivered library services in that particular university. And then that relationship, that partnership sustains today with regular meetings between student union kind of managers, they're elected students to those president and vice president positions, and the library management team, the establishment of a library critical friends group where we would get students from across the different faculties and academic departments and academics, and bring academics and students and library colleagues together to form a critical friends group, a bit like a library advisory board. And then on the flip side, making sure that we, as the library team, were represented at the student union-led Better University forums so that we could continue on several levels this dialogue that allowed this partnership to happen. When I worked as head of library services at the University of the Arts London, I used a kite mark called Customer Service Excellence to bring together 6 quite disparate college libraries. They were all kind of performing well, but there was no consistency, and I wanted to get the students involved, students from the 6 different colleges. So University of the Arts London is made up of 6 quite prolific in their own right colleges, like London College of Fashion, London College of Communication, Central St Martin's College of Art. So they all had their own identity, and so did the libraries, but it meant that students didn't get any consistency, and I as the head of service didn't really get much control over the quality. So I used a kite mark, and I used the student body to work with me to develop services in order to ensure excellence and make sure that the services were consistent and were providing what students wanted. So it involved convening lots of student focus groups around the different sites. But more importantly, getting students involved in the training and development of library staff through staff development events. Also getting students involved in policy development and developing service standards and customer service charters. So it wasn't that the library administration was being done to them. Similarly, getting students involved in developing our performance indicators and key performance indicators. So again, it was, I suppose, bringing my experience of working closely with the students and the student body to ensure that they felt they were in a position, through meaningful engagement and dialogue, but in a position to help shape services. And you could take that out. That did include things like representation on the project board and project team when we went out to tender for a new library management system, when we looked at usability and accessibility of our discovery layer, etc. So there was definitely lots of engagement, even when we around systems as well. And then finally, just another initiative. So the university I kind of ended up at, which was Goldsmiths University of London, I actually went beyond the library. It was looked to deliver a program for what we call the academic registry, which had all the student-facing services in it, including the library services, to work closely again with the student union colleagues in order to enable students to engage with those front-facing services and have some influence and shape them. And we did that through a kind of longitudinal period of staff training sessions where the training would be delivered by students, and we'd as a staff group discuss the challenges and barriers that students found in their university environment and work together to problem solve those. So I'm not going to dwell too much on those, but these are when I'm talking about student engagement now outside of the classroom, so not engagement with learning, but kind of engagement with the bigger student picture, with more about student life, and then more about how we engage with students through dialogue and partnership to help develop services. So it's about keeping the dialogue going, because for me, that relationship with the student body is the most important thing, and it is key to successful students' engagement. So if I now pose those 3 propositions back to you that I had earlier in the session, they may resonate a bit more with you now. So you might have kind of been able to piece together some of the things that I've been saying, and think, oh yeah, that's student engagement, and I do that back at my place of work. So continuously observing students how they use their libraries, that for me, that's the user engagement piece. That's the ethnographic piece that we might use in order to inform how we shape spaces, but also how we shape digital, because obviously we can do digital ethnography, we can do usability testing, cognitive walkthroughs of systems and resources, etc. Then that second proposition, engaging students by keeping on asking them what they want from the library service. Well, that's the student voice. That's capturing the student feedback, but in a meaningful way. And being professional and striving for excellence in service delivery means that we'll always be delivering an excellent student experience. But of course, what I mean by that is bringing students into that striving for excellence in service delivery through things like kite marks or collaborative staff development, etc. So, penultimate slide. What does all this actually look like? What are the things that he's actually talking about? So hopefully, again, some of these will look familiar to you. So even simple things like comment schemes, complaint schemes, suggestion schemes is a form of student engagement. Observing students in their spaces, observing how students move around your library, being proactive and having interactive teaching sessions, and really applying pedagogy to your teaching and learning, being active within digital spaces in social media, potentially employing students through library roles or internships, doing touchstone tours with your students around the library, holding focus groups, interviewing students, using students for usability testing, having student user groups help inform you, using love letters or breakup letters to find out what students like and dislike about your library service, encouraging students to reflect on their use of the library, having student library champions, ensuring representation on projects and boards, always making sure students are consulted on any changes proposed, get them involved in policy, get them involved in staff development. And then what does all that mean for digital? So I've quoted Donna Lanclow here, who you might be familiar with, writing 10 years ago now in 2014 about higher education students' post-digital learning landscapes. And Donna suggests that digital, even back then, now permeates all of our learning, and it's just understood by those who use it. And when we ask library users to think about what they do with technology or how they use the web, they're often intrigued and find it difficult to disentangle this from their everyday learning practices. And I think that's even more so the case now that we've been through a pandemic and we've all switched and pivoted to digital. That the blurring between what a physical library is and what a digital library is, or what you can access and what you can do in each, is huge now. The blurring's got greater and greater. But the main thing we should be doing is talking to students and ensuring that we're putting them at the heart of their learning and development experiences, both physical and digital from a library perspective. And just as a parting shot, I just wanted to share some screen grabs from how we teach digitally now. So I said I run or teach on a distance learning MA Library and Information Service Management program, and we ensure that students have a consistent and really high quality teaching and learning experience. So all our modules have a consistent looking presence in our virtual learning environment. We provide materials, background materials, lots of resources. It enables us to have lots of video resources and approach things from a flipped learning perspective. So we can provide activities through digital to do in advance of a timetabled online lecture. This is a screen grab of an online lecture in situ. So from one of our colleagues, so we ensure that all our modules have a timetabled, it could be 1 or 2 timetabled hourly, 2-hourly sessions every week, where we encourage students to attend, put mics and cameras on, or engage in the chat and Q&A, a bit like we're doing in this webinar. But we do that on a regular basis and also a consistent basis. We also use, as I'm sure you all do, digital teaching and learning tools. So this is a digital whiteboard where we're interacting with that, with students in that digital space. And we also make use of asynchronous discussion platforms. So this is a Google Spaces that we've got set up where we've got a dialogue going on with our students and students peer to peer outside of that digital classroom. And all I'm illustrating here is this seems quite normal now. So that Donna's quotation saying it's difficult for students to differentiate between what happens in a classroom and what happens in a digital classroom, or what happens in a library and what happens in a digital library makes sense to me. I think that's where the boundaries are completely blurred now. I think Alice is going to send the slides round, so you've got access to these references. The best ones on there are the top two by someone called Appleton. So do take a look at anything that takes your fancy there, or that you want to pick up on. And that's where I shall finish. So thanks for listening to me. Gives us about 15-20 minutes left for any questions and further discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Leo, for this really insightful presentation. We've received a few comments, a few questions, so it really does open up for a broader discussion. So actually, what I would like to start from is the very end of your presentation, because there's a few questions related to digital spaces and the environment. So you showed an example of your Blackboard platform, right? And we know libraries and students and faculty members all over the world use a variety of different platforms. It can be Canvas, Moodle, Blackboard. There's so many around. And in my experience, one thing that I got asked a lot by the librarians I've worked with is how do we make sure that we have a lot of different digital spaces and opportunities, like JoVE being one of them because it offers videos, right? But how do we integrate everything in one place? And this is a discussion that we've always had. We want everything to be in on one platform. How important do you think it is to integrate these things, these tools, from the student perspective as well?
So the quick answer, Alice, is that's very important, and I think certainly my experience as a teacher, the more systems, platforms, interfaces that students have to deal with for their teaching and learning, the harder it is, or not even just their teaching and learning, their student experience. So integrating things into a single platform or as few platforms as possible is really helpful. And universities are really good at having hundreds of different platforms. So you've got, I come at this thinking, well, my students they've got an app, they've got a timetabling interface, they've got the library catalogues at a separate interface, their Blackboard, their Google Spaces. So they've got just to get into an online lesson or even a physical lesson that's complemented with digital and online. They've probably got 5 or 6 different systems. Now, we might not be able to affect all of those 5 or 6 different systems, but where we can bring stuff together and keep it consistent, I think that's the key thing, is if you're, as a librarian, if you're putting together some digital library instruction, try and think about where that's best to sit. Is it best to sit in a curriculum virtual learning environment so students get that consistency of look and feel, rather than having to go to the library virtual learning environment or whatever it might be? So I'm really all for embedding resources into virtual learning environments and embedding library resources into those virtual learning environments. Make it as simple as possible. So don't say, I tend not to say to students, go and search the library catalogue and find some resources. It may feel like we're spoon feeding them, but I'd rather give them the access to the resources there and then, because of the sheer ubiquity and amount of information and data and knowledge available, as we all know, as librarians, as information professionals, the simpler we can make it for students in their learning, the less overwhelmed they're going to be, the less anxious they're going to be. I think there's also a kind of student well-being element here as well. So integrate and bring together as much as you can in digital, I would say.
Thanks, Leo. I think you said a very, very important word there, which is let's not make them feel overwhelmed by what we offer. Everything, needs to be as as clear and as simple as possible, even with people who are completely digitalized. They were born and raised in this digital environment. They still want something extremely simple. That's why,
Yeah.
user experience is such an important topic.
Yeah.
Coming into more of a student facing question, we have somebody asking us, can you give us an example of how we can collaborate with students to encourage that peer feeling?
That's a really good question. So I see. I think I see what you mean. So how do we position ourselves as peers with our students? So I'm going to assume that's what you mean, rather than try to facilitate students being peers to each other, because I do think that being peers with our students is important, because they're adults, and basically you want an example of how we can collaborate with students. It's not so much an example, but it's how I think I would in practice be is it's about treating the students as a peer, as an equal, to speaking to them as you would to any other adult. So it's about having a dialogue with students about how they feel. What are their attitudes towards the library? Ask them about how they feel about the library. Ask them what the challenges and the barriers are. Ask them where they think the strengths are, as you would if you were talking to another colleague, or you were talking to someone from faculty. I don't think I've got a kind of magic response to how that happens. I think it's just about being really confident in your communication skills and your interpersonal skills with students, and I suppose also be very self-aware about power dynamics that happen, and how students who maybe have moved away from home for the first time, that students come into a higher educational environment feeling like there's going to be a student-teacher power dynamic. And I always just try and break that down straight away. Ask them questions about themselves, ask them questions about their interests. I really like football. I ask students what football teams they support, and just become not overly familiar, but speak to them as you would any adult.
That's actually a great point, because I feel like being listened to, feeling heard is what drives engagement in the first place. It's the reason why people want to engage with something. So thanks for that, because I think it's something that we can all apply to our own experience as librarians as well. I do have a question related to one of the examples that you brought earlier. You were talking about letterboxes and breakup letters and all of that, and it reminded me of an initiative that I witnessed while I was at university. And we within the library we had a letterbox, and it was love letters, and it was titled "Things I Wish I Had Told You." So people would pop in all of their suggestions and things, and anonymous letters, and it was not related to the library itself, but it brought people into the library because it was physically there, right? So the librarians at one point, this was just like a pop-up by a student, created by a student. They created a library version of that. So things I wish I could have said to you, library edition. So thanking the librarians, or saying, oh, this shelf is not working very well. Oh, I can't find this book. Any kind of suggestions. It just started from a different angle. That's what I mean. So a question that I'd like to ask you is, can you give me an example of how you've seen students interact with the library in ways that are, out of the box, creative in a way?
Yeah, sure, Alice. Thanks. So I'm conscious I've crammed a lot into those slides, and so I put love letters and breakup letters. So that's just to clarify for everyone listening. And you may already know this, so apologies if I'm telling you something but that's a particular UX, user experience technique, to invite students to write a love letter to the library or write a breakup letter to the library. And in doing so, you get positive or negative feedback, but both of which you can act upon. Where I've used those in the past, I've actually used them in focus groups. So I've asked students to actually talk through their thinking around the love letter that they've just written, or the breakup letter that they've just written. So you can kind of unpack and unpick and go deeper into what they feel the strengths or the weaknesses are. So that's good for capturing student voice and then using it for service development. So what you're talking about, Alice, I think it's probably an extension of that, because I've just recollected another initiative that we had. We asked students to decorate our Christmas tree, but we asked them on the decoration to give us some feedback. So they'd create a decoration, so a bit of a maker space, a crafting space, create a decoration, but also give us some feedback on the library on the decoration, so that we could then take a look at what student comments about the library service. But other things like that, where we would encourage students to do something that they wouldn't necessarily represent with the library. We use the library to host research cafes and put on free refreshments, and we get academics to come and present their research, like a 5-minute elevator pitch on their research, and they be quite well attended events. Again, it gets students into the library, not necessarily for library activity, but certainly for scholarly activity and what they would associate with the library. And then you can kind of harness that. You've got that whole use the library for events. So you can use the library for work with your music department for recitals, work with your art department for art exhibitions and installations. We worked with our computer gamers design students to put on a gaming night. So these just allow for elements of engagement. But the point I would make is there is a difference between meaningful student engagement and kind of marketing and gimmicks in marketing. So try and be strategic in what you plan. I'm not saying that everything I've put on has been strategic. Some of it would have come across as quite gimmicky, and you can justify that in another way, in a kind of PR and profile of the library way.
Thank you for sharing all of these insights and your ideas as well. I'm sure people, well, they've remained throughout the session, so I'm sure people have appreciated as much as I have, and as much as all of the people who have commented have. So we are getting to the end of our session, so I would just like to thank everyone for staying for so long and for listening to this very, very good presentation, and for submitting your questions. You will receive a recording of this webinar, so don't worry, you can re-watch it, you can share it with your colleagues, you can send it to anybody. It will be, free to reuse as you please. And I would just like, again, to thank everyone and Dr. Leo Appleton for joining us today as our guest speaker.
Thank you for having me, Alice, and thanks for everybody's comments and questions.
Have a great evening, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.